Hi, I'm Helen from Heritage Garden Seeds, and today we're going to do the sow along for our broad bean Aquadulce Claudia. So Aquadulce Claudia is a great variety for sowing in the autumn, and it is about the middle of November now, so we're going to get these sown and then we're going to overwinter them so that we can just be that little bit further ahead next spring. So you can direct sow your autumn broad beans, but as it's rather wet up here in Cheshire, we're going to sow ours into these modules and then keep them in the greenhouse over the winter, just where we can keep an eye on them and make sure they don't get too damp and wet, because the last thing that they need is to just be sat in wet, soggy soil all winter. It's just going to make them rot. So you can sow it in modules like these, or if you've got some 9cm pots, that would probably be better. I'm just going to use what I have and try and maximise the space. So I have filled up my module tray. These are rather large cells, so I'm going to sow one seed per cell. So our broad bean seeds are quite large, as you can see, so a nice, easy, manageable size. And each seed has a little scar on its edge, and we're just going to sow that with the scar pointing down into the soil. So we're going to do one seed per cell. Just push that in. So ideally, you want to sow your beans around 5cm deep. This is obviously a little bit less just with me doing them in these modules. So if you've got deeper modules or just deeper 9cm pots, that would be absolutely perfect. But as I don't have much space in the greenhouse, I'm just going to work with what I have. Once the plants start growing, I'll assess what the weather's like. And if I feel like it'll be okay to transplant them into the ground, then I will do that. And then I'm just going to backfill with a bit of soil. So now that they're nicely tucked in, I'm going to give those a light water. So we want the soil to be moist but not soaking wet, because if the beans are sat in soaking wet soil, they're just going to rot. And then I'm going to pop this module tray into an unheated greenhouse where the seeds can germinate. So we are forecast some frost this week, and I think there's going to be temperatures of around about -4 degrees. So I'm going to keep an eye on the weather. Ideally, we want the broad beans to be at least around 7 degrees Celsius to germinate. Germination will be slower, obviously, at that temperature than if the temperature was a bit warmer. But they should still be fine in the unheated greenhouse. But as the temperatures drop towards the end of the week, I'm just going to keep an eye on those in case I have to bring them in and just pop them in the garage where it's just going to be 1 or 2 degrees warmer. But these are a hardy variety, so hopefully everything will be okay. But it's just important to keep an eye on them, especially in that germination phase, which is critical. We don't want them too cold. We don't want them to be too wet. We just don't want them to be sat in freezing cold, wet soil, because they're just going to rot rather than germinate. So over the winter, I'm just going to keep an eye on these and make sure that the soil isn't too wet, but equally make sure it doesn't dry out, because that's just going to hinder the growth and cause stress to the plants. If you direct sowing your broad beans into the ground, just keep an eye on the weather over the winter months. If we're experiencing particularly cold snaps, you may want to cover your broad beans with some horticultural fleece just to keep them nicely tucked in. And that will also help prevent bird damage too. Like anything that we sow over winter, there are probably going to be some losses. This is just like a little insurance policy to try and get us ahead. But like I say, these are a hardy variety, so we should still be left with plenty of plants by spring. We can also resow these again in the spring as well, just to try and extend that season that little bit. So when the soil starts to warm up that little bit in the spring, we want to start hardening off these plants if we have grown them in the greenhouse over winter. So that just means bringing them outside during the day and popping them back in the greenhouse in the evening. Doing that for a few days just gets them used to different fluctuations in temperature and gets them used to wind and the elements and things like that. And then we can look to transplant them into their final growing positions. When we transplant them into the ground, we want to plant the plants about 20cm apart. And if you do like a zigzag pattern, then they will, for the most part, support themselves. They will still need some extra supports as well, but they'll just help each other stand up a little bit more if we do that zigzag pattern. And then as our plants grow and get plenty of flowers on them, we can start to pinch out the growing tips. So for autumn sowings like this, it'll probably be around early May. And if you're sowing in the spring, later on in May will be fine. So wait till they've got plenty of flowers on, and then we're just going to pinch out the tops of those plants. So that's going to stop them growing any taller. But the main reason we do this is to try and reduce or prevent the black fly, which love feasting on your broad bean plants. And then once you have plenty of those nice juicy broad bean pods producing on your plants, wait till they're about 7cm in length. They should feel small but full, and that is going to be the best time to harvest your broad beans. And then all that is left to do is decide if you are a single or a double podder. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. The best place is always on Instagram, so the handle is @Heritage Garden Seeds.